Everyone. Wanted to take some time here to turn around and talk about another facet of perception. If you have not already seen the lectures over perceptual constancy and perceptual organization, I would strongly recommend you watch those first. Perceptual organization is really sort of part one, and perceptual constancy is part two. But now I want to turn around and get into what is depth perception. Now, basically, the definition I have right there of depth perception is the ability to perceive the world in a three dimensions. Okay, you look at something that is strictly on a piece of paper or on a board, and it's in two dimensions, not three dimensions. You, as a human being, are actually pretty good at doing this. You really, truly are. You pull up behind a vehicle, you want to have the ability to make sure you don't run into the back of that vehicle. You rely on depth perception. Now, to be good at this, depth perception is a function of three things. There are really three things that you need to be good at depth perception. And the first thing is this. If you're going to gauge distance and depth between you and another object, one of the first things you rely upon are objects in the environment. And what I mean by that is this. When I have done a very simple experiment in class, I will ask a student, randomly choose someone from class, and I will ask them, from where you're sitting to where I am standing, how far apart do you think we are in feet, using feet as a unit of measure? And obviously, one of the very first things that students do when you ask them that question is they sort of look at the ground, they look at the tables, they look at objects in the environment to help them make that determination. And then they turn around and say, well, 10 feet or 15 feet, whatever the distance may possibly be. So one of the keys to gauging depth is having objects in the environment to help you make that determination. Sometimes when you're in a situation, if you're ever in a situation where you're way out at sea, or you're in the middle of a very open place, you don't have objects around you such as trees or other items, it can be sort of deceiving to determine how far something truly is from you. So that is one of the keys to gauging depth, is relying on whatever is in the environment to help you figure it out as cues. Another thing that can influence how good you are at depth perception is your ability of your eye to detect stimuli. Okay. Are you in the dark? Are you in bright light? Are you in dim light? Are you not seeing well? The capacity of the eye at that given moment has a say on how good you are at determining the distance between you and another object. So you have objects in the environment, the capacity of the eye, and finally, the ability of one's brain to interpret what it's getting. Okay? If you, some of that is learned. Depth perception is learned. It is not all automatic. You have to be a little bit careful about some things. And we learn to get better at things as we go through our lives as far as gauging depth. But these three things are really very important if you're going to determine the distance between you and an object. You need to look at other objects in the environment. You have to take into consideration what your eye is able to take in at that time, and how your brain is interpreting that which it has. There are really two types of depth perception. Since we as human beings have two eyes, there are really two types of depth perception. Any depth perception or depth cues that really require both our eyes, we have to use both eyes, is what are called binocular depth cues. Okay, BI is Latin for two. So a binocular depth cue requires a minimum of two eyes, or for humans, for both eyes to gauge depth. And one type of binocular depth cue that we rely on probably 99% of the time is what is called disparity, or binocular disparity in this case. By disparity, what I mean is this. What you are doing is you are taking in visual input from both eyes to gauge distance. Visual input from both eyes to gauge distance. When I ask that student in class, he or she, how far apart do you think we are? Very rarely, well, never, to be honest, do they close one eye and make that judgment. They rely on visual input from their left eye and their right eye to determine how far we are apart. And because of that, all right, that is a version of disparity. They're taking in visual input from the left eye and the right eye, sending it to the brain, and then gauging depth and so on and so forth. So we do this one all the time. Okay, we do it all the time. If you happen to look at an object or pick up on an object that is off to one side of your field of vision, it's more towards the left side or the right side of your head, so your right eye or your left eye is seeing more of it. That's when we start to talk about disparity a little bit. But it's still the same thing. We're relying on visual input from both eyes, typically, to gauge where something is. Another little demonstration you can do is this. Take a pen or a pencil and hold it in your hand and hold it straight out in front of you, okay? And focus on the very top of the pen or pencil. Just, maintain your focus on that. And as you're looking at the top of that pen or pencil, turn around and start to slowly bring it in, okay? You're holding it straight up and down. Bring it slowly in towards your face. You might even get to the point that your pen or pencil is touching the tip of your nose. And if you're still trying to keep that focus on the very top of the pen or pencil and it's right up next to your face, it doesn't take long for the muscles around the eye to start to hurt. And you sort of have to blink and stop what you're doing and go, wow, that hurts. This is an example of what we call convergence. Convergence is a fascinating type of binocular depth cue because what you're doing is this. Your brain is relying on the muscles that make up the eye, that surround the eye, okay, both eyes in fact, and your brain can actually read muscular input. It can interpret muscular input to help gauge depth, okay? So if your eyes have to look at something very, very close to you and the muscles have to strain to turn around and help you maintain that focus, that muscular input being read by the brain is an example of convergence. So you are a very well-developed piece of machinery. You can rely not only on visual input from both eyes to gauge distance, but you can also rely on muscular input from the muscles surrounding the eyes. They send information to the brain to gauge distance. Now, one thing you need to know is this about convergence. Convergence and interpreting muscular inputs, okay, or outputs by the brain really only works from about 4 feet in. And by that I mean any object more than 4 feet away. If you're looking at an object that's 40 feet away, okay, it's 40 feet away, and the object moves. Yes, the muscles in your eyes will adjust your eyes and move your eyes, but it is so minute that it's relying much more on the visual input than the muscular input at that point. So with convergence really is only a factor if something is very, very close. All right, 4 feet are in, then your brain automatically starts to interpret not only visual input, but muscular input, engaging depth. So these are two types of what we call binocular depth cues. You really need both eyes to make this work. The other type is what is called a monocular depth cue. And with a monocular depth cue, M-O-N-O, mono is Latin for one. And with a monocular depth cue, you really only need one eye, though you have two. You only need one eye to gauge depth, okay? Now, some of these monocular depth cues may actually seem like optical illusions, and we'll get into that here shortly. But all things considered, when in fact they're not, but all things considered, to gauge depth, you don't need both eyes. So let me talk about some of these different types of monocular depth cues. A lot of these monocular depth cues involve just looking at an image. But motion parallax is an example of relying on movement to gauge distance. Okay? Motion parallax is an example of relying on movement to determine how far something away is. Know this. If you look out the window of your car as you're driving down the road. Maybe you're a passenger instead of being the driver. And you look out the window of your vehicle at one moment and you see, something 10 feet off the road, like a sign, or 15 feet off the road, like a sign, speed limit, 70 miles an hour. Instead of, you look 150 feet behind that sign and there's a building. And behind that building, about 1,500 feet, okay, a third of a mile away is a big, big hill or mountain or something like that. If I were to ask students, and I've done this before, which of the three things, the sign, the building, or the mountain, which seems to be going by the fastest? Well, most students will look at me and say, well, the sign is seems to be going by the fastest. What seems to be going by the slowest? Well, the mountain. I said, are you passing both at the same speed, 70 miles an hour, let's say? And they say yes. Well, this is an example of motion parallax. Motion parallax occurs when we turn around and find that objects closer to us seem to go by faster than objects off in the distance. Let me say that again. Objects, the closer they are to us, they seem to go by faster than objects way off in the distance. When in reality, you're passing all of them, in this case, at 70 miles an hour. You look at a plane, for those of you who have ever flown on a commercial jet. You look at a plane up in the heavens, all right? You see that contrail and stuff like that. You see here in the picture. And a lot of times, if you don't know this, a lot of jets fly between 300 to 500 miles an hour. I mean, they're hauling up there. They are really, really moving. And they can be 30,000 feet up in the air, all right, and possibly higher. But when we look at them off in the distance, think about how often they seem to just crawl along. They're just crawling along. They're not really moving that fast. Well, actually, they are moving fast. Like I said, up to 500 miles an hour fast. But we don't notice that, okay? We don't see that. That is an example of motion parallax because really the plane is so terribly far away from us, many, many, many miles away from us, that it just looks like it's crawling across the heavens when in reality it is not. Okay, and a lot of times there's no other cues up there if it's against a blue sky to help you make that determination. But that watching planes fly overhead when they're 30,000 feet up is an excellent example of motion parallax. The closer things are, the faster they seem to go by. The farther things are from us, the slower they seem to go by. Now, these monocular depth cues are what we call pictorial cues or picture cues, okay? They don't really focus on motion or movement. And I may go through these too fast or real fast. If I go too fast, just obviously stop the video and write down whatever you need. But another type of monocular depth cue that really only requires one eye is called texture gradient. And texture gradient simply says this: objects that are nearer to us seem to be more well-defined, okay? You can see more detail. When objects are way off in the distance, all right, they seem to be more smooth and solid and complete and flowing. You look at the picture of these flowers here, okay, sunflowers. And up close, you can see the distance between each sunflower. You can see a bit of green, a lot of green, as well as more of the details of each flower. But you look at the hill off in the distance, and it seems like a solid, semi-solid area of yellow. This is a fantastic example of texture gradient. The closer something is, the more detail there is. The farther off it is, basically, the more solid it really appears, when in fact it's not. Interposition, also known as overlap, is another type of monocular depth cue. And simply put, this is an example where those objects that you see more of, those objects that you seemingly can see more of, tend to be closer to you. As you look at this picture of the Ozark Mountains, and you've got several hills and things like that, that which is in the bottom right-hand corner you can see most completely. That which is behind it seems obscured by another hill, which is obscured by another hill, which is obscured by another hill, and so on. And anything that's obscured you tend to perceive as being far away. And this is just it can be a something of an illusion, but a lot of times it's learned. What we see more of, we tend to perceive to be closer to us. If I stand at school in front of a podium, and students can turn around and see more of me than they can the podium. If you ask the person in the back of the room, which is closer to you, the podium or the teacher? Well, they say the teacher. Why is that? Well, because you can see more of the teacher, so it's just understood that they must be closer to you. All right. Linear perspective. Linear perspective is a fascinating one. And let me say this real quick before I forget it. With all of these, linear perspective, overlap, all of these, if you become an artist, you use these to create a three-dimensional image on a piece of paper, or something like that. But getting back to linear perspective is sort of a depth cue in which parallel lines, okay, lines that run parallel, seem to converge off in the distance. So if you look at this picture of this road here, this two-lane road, pretty wide open, and the white lines that are parallel throughout, it seems that maybe a couple of miles down, maybe farther than that these two white lines will come together. If you ever walk along a set of railroad tracks, all right, and they go straight for a long, long ways, and you look off in the distance, it may look like the railroad tracks actually converge off in the distance. Well, obviously they don't. If you were to walk down a mile or 2 miles or whatever, you're going to realize they're still equal distance apart. All right. Probably if you look back from where you came, now they will look like they are converging off in the distance. This is what linear perspective is. And all things considered, it's something of an optical illusion. Of course, that doesn't really happen, but it's some rule that we have learned in our heads. All right, parallel lines look like they converge off in the distance. There's also what is called aerial perspective. Anyone who's ever flown over our country, flown over the Midwest especially, all right, you tend to turn around and look down from far above. It's similar to texture gradient, but you look down from far above and everything seems to be pretty smooth. Okay. I've had the opportunity to fly over the Rocky Mountains, flying out west. And from 30,000 feet up, looking out the window, the mountains don't look that impressive. I mean, they are, but they don't look like they're near the terrain that we know them to be. And that's because of aerial perspective. Things look a lot smoother and so on. Before D-Day, World War II, D-Day, and the invasion of Europe by Allied forces, there was a lot of reconnaissance flights flying over Normandy, okay? And they turned around and they were looking down at the ground so that when we turned around and invaded Europe, all right, we would see what they saw was basically this. They saw these rows of trees, which a lot of times had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years as a way to mark off different plots of land that belonged to different people and so on. They were referred to as the Normandy hedgerows. And looking down on them from 10,000 feet up, they pretty much decided that this wouldn't be a very big deal, that when D-Day occurred, tanks could just run right over these hedgerows and continue on, no issue. From way up there high, it didn't seem to be an issue. What a lot of the Allied forces found out and realized when they landed was that in reality, these hedgerows were not very small and tiny. In fact, as you see by this design here, a lot of the trees were very close together. Sometimes there were ditches on either side of these hedgerows that were up to 2 feet deep. Okay. This mound of dirt we thought wasn't very big, was as much as 10 feet wide. And sometimes the trees sat, up to 4 to 8 feet above ground level. So here you are pulling up your tank. You've been told that these hedgerows were just hedges. That's what they look like from 10,000 or 20,000 feet up. But when you get there, you realize you've got yourself a problem. Now you've got to get your tank to come over this 8-foot hill, through this 2-foot ditch, over this 8-foot hill. You could sit there and blow the trees up or burn them. But then if you did, these steep banks, A lot of times the Germans saw what you were doing. They're standing on the other side or hiding on the other side, and they see where you're starting to come through, and they just wait for you there. So that obviously didn't work. Aerial perspective. Things can look very smooth, very even from a great distance above, but when you get down there close, you realize it's not necessarily the case. Last one I want to mention here is what is referred to as relative size. And this one is as much about memory as it is perception. Because with relative size, what you're basically doing is this. You're relying not only on visual inputs, but you're relying on what you know from memory. Now, this isn't much of a drawing, I admit that. But basically, you have this caveman here with a spear in his hand. And you can ask people, well, what is he wanting to throw that spear at? Is he going to throw it at the elephant? Is he going to throw it at the tree? Is he going to throw it at the elk? What's he going to do? And most people turn around and really without hesitation will say he's throwing it at the elk. Okay? I can understand that. But if you argue with them, and there is a little bit of overlap in interposition here, if you argue with them to make a point, you say, well, it looks like that spear is lined up perfectly with that elephant. Okay? It's right in direct line. You say, well, that can't possibly be. I'll hear people tell me. I said, well, how do you know that he ain't throwing that spear at that elephant? And students will say, well, elephants are huge. They're big, big animals, and that one's pretty tiny, so we know for a fact that it must be far away. And they're right. Relative size is based not only on perception, but what we know, memory, what we know in our memory. And in this case, when it comes to memory, we know that elephants tend to be very, very big animals, and this one is not. So because of that, we can pretty much convince ourselves, rightly so, that that elephant must be way off in the distance. So that's a lot of how relative size works in that regard. We know how this stuff is perceived, but we also know from past experiences how things work. The last thing I want to mention, and I'm going to add it to this video because it doesn't take much, is to talk about depth perception. Everything we've talked about so far has focused on vision, depth perception, and visual input. I want to talk very briefly about depth perception and its relationship to sound. Now, we as human beings, and a lot of animals out there, will rely on sound as a way of gauging distance or depth, just as much as vision. Maybe we rely more on vision. But I've asked this of students. If you've ever gone deer hunting, okay? You ever gone deer hunting, and you find yourself in a situation, I've asked students this. Does a deer have to see you to decide to bolt and run? If it hears something, will it stay there and wait till it sees you before it decides to run? And anyone who's been deer hunting has told me repeatedly, and I know this for a fact, that the answer is no, the deer does not have to wait. If it hears something, it relies a lot on sound as much as it does vision. It may never know what it was that it ran from, but it was pretty loud and it was getting louder, and so it decided it's time to get out of there. One of the ways many animals, and even humans, gauge distance between us and objects is relying on how loud a sound is. Okay? We call this an intensity difference. And in this particular instance, what we're talking about is this. Without getting into a discussion of decibels, we know that ambulances tend to be very, very loud. Okay? And so if we hear an ambulance as we're driving down the road and it's not very loud, the sound we're hearing is not very loud, it's pretty safe to say that that ambulance is nowhere near us. It must be, a quarter mile away, a half a mile away, possibly farther. All right? The louder something gets, the closer it tends to be. The less intense the sound, the farther away it is. And if we know how loud something typically is, if we know how loud an ambulance typically is, and we'll just say loud, and it's not, then we know that it's nowhere close to us. So one of the ways that we gauge the distance between ourselves and objects is how loud something is, or how loud it is not. Last thing is a time difference. Now, to explain this one is a little bit tricky, but I think we can understand this. Your brain is so well developed that you can determine the direction a sound is coming from based on the time it takes to reach one ear versus the other. Let me say that again. You can determine the direction a sound is coming from based on the amount of time it takes for sound to reach one ear versus the other ear. Now, that can be just a fraction of a second, okay? Just a fraction of a second. If someone or something you hear is to your left side or to your right side, it will actually reach your left ear before it wraps around your head to your right ear. Your brain is so well designed that it can determine the direction a sound is coming from based on that difference in time. If there's an object sort of off to one side, maybe 45 degrees to your right, and for whatever reason you can't see it, sound will reach your right ear before it reaches your left ear. In that case, if it's just 45 degrees off to the side rather than directly off to one side, it'll reach around to your other ear even faster. But your brain has no problem with that. You can determine where a sound is coming from based on the time difference in time it takes to reach one ear versus another. Where would a person, here's a question for you, where would a person have to be to make it the most difficult to be able to pick up on something? Okay? And the answer is if something is directly behind you, or assuming you can't see it, directly in front of you. Why? Because sound reaches both ears at the same time. If sound reaches both ears at the same time, we can be a little bit fooled as to where something is coming from. How do we determine where it's coming from? Quite honestly, we turn our head. Imagine how many times you hear something and you can't determine where it's coming from. So what does a person do? They cock their head to one side or the other. They break the continuity. And in so doing, that helps them to figure out where it is coming from. Okay? All right. That's all I want to get into with this particular video. That really finishes up my material on depth perception. All right. Hope that is helpful. Take care.